Last time in this series I am now choosing to dub Interesting Lives, we came full circle. Or rather, we finished a trilogy and now we are starting a new one, so really now we're coming full circle. We did Ernst Röhm, a bad guy, then we did Junipero Serra, an ambiguous guy, and then we did Bob Ross, a good guy. So I think now it's time for another bad guy. Or rather, a bad gal, because today we're going to be talking about Elizabeth Báthory. And yes, I will be mispronouncing all of the words today. I do speak several languages. Pronouncing things in foreign languages is a forte of mine. But Hungarian, I just cannot. It is of course true that my best friend is Hungarian and I could just call her up and she would tell me how to pronounce these words properly. Or I could just have like really cheap and bad comedic value that'll make you cringe more than it'll make you laugh by just butchering all these words that there is really no reason for me to be butchering. So without further ado, I present to you the Blood Countess, Dame Dracula, the Vampire of Čachtice Castle, Elizabeth Báthory. Elizabeth was born right here in near Báthory, which has an extremely cool coat of arms, but let's be honest, Hungary and Romania are the kings of having great coats of arms. However, she spent her childhood in Exed, which is right next door really, but unfortunately has a slightly less cool coat of arms, and also today it is no longer called Exed, but Nagy Exed. The Báthorys were an incredibly powerful family. Elizabeth's older brother was the second highest judge in Hungary after the king. Her nephew was a cardinal in the Catholic Church, even though Elizabeth herself was a Calvinist Protestant. Her uncle was the voivode of Transylvania, which is basically like a government-appointed big boss of the whole region. Her grandfather also had been voivode of Transylvania in the past. Oh yes, and her other uncle was the King of Poland, Grand Duke of Lithuania, and Prince of Transylvania. So yeah, they were a big deal. While we're all about coats of arms, this is the Báthory one, though admittedly the one Elizabeth chose for herself is once again slightly more badass. It's ironic that she eventually really became the mythical dragon that took sacrifices from the town. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The Báthory line sprang from the Gutkalids, a sort of clan with roots in Swabia and Venice that established itself in Hungary in the 13th century. The founder of the house, Briccius Báthory, was given his charter by the King of Hungary and also Croatia as a reward for military service. However, to their own family creation myth, they were founded by a man named Vitus, who in the year 900 defeated a dragon near Exed Castle and was thus given the castle as a reward, and also the name Báthory, which means good hero. Thing is, the castle was only built in the 14th century, so the timeline is a little off. Being born into the family that she was born into, Elizabeth had access to the best of the best. The finest tutors made her into probably the most educated woman in all of Hungary at the time. She was extremely well-read, knowledgeable about a lot of things, skilled in administration, and aside from Hungarian also spoke Latin, Greek, and German. However, she was engaged at age 10 and then married aged 15 in what was apparently the wedding event of the century, because there were a lot of people there. It was in like a prime location, just big time event. The guy in question, by the way, was one Ferenc Nadasdy, who, boy oh boy, is he a character in his own right. He was a renowned warrior called the Black Knight of Hungary and fought against the Ottoman Empire in their occupation of the Balkans. He also impaled people like Vlad the Impaler, so really he wasn't just removing kebab, he was also making kebab spits. By the way, Elizabeth did not, as would usually have been the case, take her husband's last name of Nadasdy. Don't get me wrong, the Nadasdys were a powerful family, but the Báthorys were just so much higher on the social ladder that she flat out refused to take her husband's name. And so she was called Báthory forever. Though the Báthorys no longer exist, the Nadasdys do, with new members of the house being born as late as 2014. all over the world. But let's get back to the point. Ferenc did not really stay with her, he basically immediately moved to Vienna for his studies. He was 19 at the time and sort of finishing his military education. Also, we see this picture a lot in historical depictions, but I found this on Wikipedia, and it's supposed to be Elizabeth as reconstructed from historical descriptions, so I'm not surprised Ferenc preferred being far away from this. Though rumor has it that Elizabeth at this point was already a mother. She had given birth to the child of a peasant boy, which was then given to a common woman to raise far away from the Báthory household. The point being that somebody did want to hit that. But not to leave her with nothing, and of course her being his wife now, Ferenc gave her his estate of Čachtice castle, because he could do that on account of he was super rich. Čachtice castle was a beautiful fortress located right here in the Carpathian Mountains and modern-day Slovakia, and today it looks like this because it was abandoned in the early 18th century. While her husband was away fighting war, Elizabeth did the administration and ruling duties of the estate. And let's be honest, with how educated she was, and with how much more educated she was than her husband, who could barely read and write, probably she was a lot better at it than he would have been. Nobody seemed to notice that the turnover of servant girls and maids was maybe the slightest bit high at her castle. Many girls were being offered great jobs, working directly for some of the highest nobility of the country in a castle. That was a coveted position. And then they just sort of disappeared into the bowels of the structure, or sometimes turned up dead elsewhere. Ferenc died in battle in 1604 of an unknown disease. Like, literally, he died of the disease while in the process of fighting the battle. Knowing that her husband would never return, Elizabeth got cocky. Historians don't exactly agree if Ferenc even knew what was going on. Some suggest he may have even been taking part in some of the early murders, but also restraining Elizabeth in what she did. But with him gone, she was the undisputed lady of the castle. She had a lot of minor noble families send their daughters to her so they could learn proper court etiquette, which was not an uncommon practice at the time. Thing is, most of them also didn't come back ever. It's not that they lost themselves in the labyrinthine halls of Chicken Wings Castle. No, they were fucking murdered. Not only that, but before they were murdered, they were tortured by the Countess herself, sometimes assisted by staff. Pretty much any form of torture that you can imagine, Elizabeth did it to young girls. This reached from classics like having the shit beaten out of them to having Elizabeth bite off pieces of flesh in their face and other body parts. Some more exotic things like covering their bodies in honey and then releasing wild ants and bees on them also occurred. Some were frozen or starved to death, others were prodded with needles until they bled out, and one particular girl was forced to cook and then proceed to eat her own flesh. Some were cut with scissors, prodded with hot irons, or simply whipped to pieces. Being as powerful as she was, Elizabeth owned a lot of people who would help her in these things, many of them procuring girls aged between 10 and 20 for her. At some point, you could witness a bunch of guys just abducting a girl and then sending her to Chinese Whisper's castle for the Countess's pleasure. Of course she had people around her. She had armed men around her that probably had morals and knew that what was happening was wrong. But she was Elizabeth Báthory, and these people were peasants and maybe like minor gentry. If anyone so much as would have laid a hand on her, the entire Báthory family would have descended upon them and murdered anyone they had ever met. This is how a single woman basically had an entire castle with significant staff completely in her clutches, completely in on what was going on without ever ringing the bell. Even for nobles, she was untouchable. Apparently, torture was part of the usual proceedings of any event on holidays and family gatherings at Chalkboard Castle, even the wedding of her own daughter. There were rumors of orgies of people bathed in blood, with Elizabeth as a kind of demonic master of ceremonies. Though, much like stories about her bathing in the blood of young girls so she would stay young, probably that didn't happen. This whole culture of murder wasn't just a thing that happened for a few years and was then stopped, like it happens for most serial killers. No, the Peregrine Falcon Castle Murder Time Fun Time event ran for 25 fucking years. That is until Istvan Magyari, a Lutheran minister, made several complaints against the Countess at the royal court in Vienna between 1602 and 1604. At this point in time, rumors of her activities had spread, but you wouldn't be saying them too loudly, because depending on which people heard you when you accused a Báthory of doing something this impossibly heinous, you might find yourself dead. It is thus unsurprising that even the king only sent someone to go check what was even going on in 1610. This man was György Thurzó, who was a high-ranking court official and brother-in-arms of Ferenc Nadasdy. He went there, conducted a major investigation, and then at some point just strolled into the castle and apparently caught her in the act of torturing young girls with the help of 4 servants. When Thurzó's men searched the castle, apparently they found quite a few dead girls, and also some that weren't dead yet. He had detectives and notaries assemble statements from over 300 people, and this was peasants, this was nobles, this was castle staff, this was everyone. It turns out that during her tenure as Lady of the Castle, Elizabeth Báthory had tortured and killed up to 650 young girls. There was supposedly a list that she kept with all of the names that was 650 items long, but that list was never physically entered into evidence, and the court eventually decided on 80 victims. Though there were 2 minor trials, she was never tried at the royal court in Vienna. This is even though Matthias II, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Germany, King of Bohemia, Archduke of Austria, and King of Hungary and Croatia at first demanded one. But apparently Thurzó managed to convince him that this was a bad idea, as it would erode the trust of the nobility into the crown, if not even the most powerful families could do whatever they pleased at all times. Also, probably a significant amount of the huge debt that the king owed Elizabeth Báthory and her family was forgiven, so that might have something to do with it. So instead of facing trial and potentially being executed, Elizabeth Báthory was confined to a lavish apartment inside her own castle, which, according to some sources, was bricked up, but this was never conclusively proven. The death penalty, by the way, is what most of her servants received. Some of them were even tortured beforehand. She died 4 years later, and instead of being buried in an unmarked grave, as she had done to so many, she was interred at the church in the town where she had killed a lot of young girls. However, because the peasants were less than amused by this, her body was eventually moved to the family crypt in Exed, and nobody knows where it is today. But it wouldn't be a complex historical situation if it didn't come with at least a little bit of tinfoil. Some historians have suggested that none of these things ever happened, and instead Elizabeth Báthory was the victim of a massive conspiracy by the Catholic Church and the Habsburg family. Because remember, she was a Protestant, and at the time religious tension and also disputes about land ownership were pretty hot in Hungary. By discrediting Elizabeth and her family, the crown had a lot to gain. If it had actually come to a trial in Vienna, they could have seized all of her estates, which were worth a lot of money and power. Seriously, when it came to castles and fortifications and strategic positions, Elizabeth was nothing short of a mogul. Plus, the church could brand all Protestants barbarians. There are, however, a few other factors to consider. The initial accusations against her were made by a Lutheran Protestant minister. Her nephew was a cardinal in the Catholic Church. I mean, not at that point anymore. He'd been dead for like a handful of years. And there was an unprecedented amount of testimony and physical evidence against her. Plus, Matthias II still chose to forego the trial when he had her by the ovaries, even though he could at that point have dismantled her and large parts of those around her. He did, after all, have good reason to do so. And not only would this potentially have affected the Báthorys, but also the Nadasdys, who were not always necessarily on the king's side, especially the parts of the house that were in Transylvania, and also he owed a lot of money to them as well. Transylvania and the Habsburgs have historically had a bit of a problematic relationship. So there you have her, Elizabeth Báthory, one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. Probably even the most prolific. If you look at the numbers, she killed anywhere between 80 and 650, so the only people who possibly had more than her are Liu Pengli, Gilles Desrailles, and Peter Niers. Even if you stay at the lower end of the numbers, the vast majority of modern serial killers could not compete with her. And I have to say, I'm happy about that, because serial killers, though a morbid fascination of mine, are fucking scary, and I am glad that they don't get to kill as many people anymore. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, do all of the things. Consider supporting me on Patreon, following me on Twitter. Christmas season is coming up, so maybe get yourself some of the merch, or maybe get your fellow TheBurgerkrieg fans that you totally know in real life, because I'm such a widespread phenomenon. Some BurgerKrieg. Get random people BurgerKrieg merch. Buy BurgerKrieg merch, give it to a homeless guy on the street. Give him like a sweater, or a t-shirt, or even a mug. Like I have thermos flasks in the merch store. In that spirit, this is the point where I would usually have something relevant to say to the episode. But what am I going to say? Like, be serial killers? Don't apprehend serial killers. That shit is dangerous. But if you know someone who's a serial killer, call the police. And see you around, cunts.